Officer Bradley Cole thought he could get away with planting drugs on Monica Harris, a devoted black teacher just driving home after class. What he didn't know was that he had picked the wrong woman, and that single act would spiral into the worst mistake of his life. How can a woman who chooses silence in court turn that silence into the very weapon that destroys him? If this story grips you, hit like and share it with someone who believes in justice now. Let's step into the courtroom. Monica Harris believed in simple victories, the kind that came not from headlines or applause, but from seeing a child's eyes light up when a hard lesson finally clicked. At 43, she had long since traded ambition for purpose. By day, she was a community school teacher. By night, she volunteered her time running free classes in the basement of a neighborhood center. For her, teaching wasn't just it was a quiet promise to the children who had been told the world didn't expect much from them. That evening, the room still carried the faint smell of chalk dust and notebook paper. A few stray voices lingered as students packed up their bags. They had just finished a lesson on civic rights, something Monica always slipped in when she could. Knowledge was armor, and she wanted her students to wear it. As the kids filed out, one boy, thin, maybe 15, paused at the door. He looked back at her with curiosity in his eyes. "Miss Harris?" he asked almost shyly. Were you ever a lawyer? I saw that picture on the wall. It looked like you in a suit standing in front of a big building." The question froze the air for just a moment. Monica's lips curled into a faint smile, soft but guarded. She adjusted her glasses, gathering her papers into a neat pile. "Oh, that old photo," she replied lightly, her tone dismissive, almost playful. "Just a memory from another time. Now hurry, you'll miss your bus." The boy wanted to press her, but her eyes said gently, "Not tonight." He grinned, waved, and darted out to join the others. The classroom fell into silence. Monica slipped her books into her bag, her mind drifting not to the past but to the present. Her mortgage, her lesson plans for tomorrow, the aching stiffness in her shoulders. She stepped outside into the crisp evening air, her breath visible under the glow of the street lamps. Her car waited at the curb, a silver sedan, not flashy but new, purchased only months earlier, after years of saving every spare dollar. It was her quiet symbol of independence, proof that discipline could still yield reward. She slid into the driver's seat, exhaled deeply, and started the engine. Soft jazz hummed through the speakers as she merged onto the quiet street. For a few brief seconds, life felt steady, calm earned. Then, without warning, the calm shattered. A pair of red and blue lights exploded in her rearview mirror, followed by the piercing wail of a siren. Her chest tightened. Her hands instinctively gripped the wheel. Not tonight, she thought. Not now. Monica signaled, pulling to the side of the road. The siren cut off, leaving only the harsh strobe of lights behind her. She sat frozen, her pulse quickening, trying to steady her breath. Her father's words echoed in her memory, words he had repeated to her. Growing up, when those lights flash, keep your hands where they can see them. Don't argue. Don't give them a reason. The driver's side mirror reflected a shadow approaching, broad shoulders, steady stride, a flashlight cutting through the night. Officer Bradley Cole. He was in his late 30s, his jaw set hard, eyes sharp and cold. From the instant he saw the car, his thoughts had already turned sour. A late-model sedan, driven by a black woman in this part of town, it gnawed at his pride, clawed at his sense of order. No way she owns that, he thought bitterly. No way. He rapped on her window, the knock sharp, impatient. Monica lowered it halfway, her fingers trembling though her face remained composed. "License and registration." Cole demanded, his voice low and edged with disdain. He didn't bother with the polite pretense. His eyes scanned her face, then the leather interior, then back at her hands. "Yes, officer," Monica replied calmly, reaching slowly into her purse where her wallet lay. She moved deliberately, each motion exaggerated so there could be no mistake. She handed him the documents with steady hands, her tone respectful, almost rehearsed. Cole snatched them, glancing over the details. His mouth twisted into something between a smirk and a sneer. "You drive this car?" he asked, as though the idea itself were offensive. "Yes," Monica answered softly, her eyes meeting his for the briefest moment. She didn't add anything more. He let the silence hang, stretching it into a display of power. His flashlight beam swept across her face, then the back seat, then lingered on her work bag. The judgment in his eyes was unmistakable. For Monica, the moment felt like a familiar weight pressing down decades of history condensed into a single roadside stop. She had done nothing wrong, and yet in the space between his questions and her answers, the balance of power tilted heavily against her. Cole scribbled something on his pad, still shaking his head, slightly muttering under his breath, words she couldn't quite catch but didn't need to. She already knew their meaning. She sat there in silence, her hands folded on the steering wheel, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. Inside, though, her heart hammered with a mix of fear and frustration. The flashing lights painted her skin in alternating shades of red and blue. To anyone passing by, it looked like routine police work. But to Monica and to anyone who had lived her truth, it was clear power had ceased to be protection. Tonight, power was being wielded as a weapon. And for the first time that evening, Monica's quiet sense of control began to slip, not because of what she had done, but because of who she was. Officer Bradley Cole circled the sedan slowly, the beam of his flashlight slicing across the paint like he was hunting for flaws. He took his time, dragging each step out, making sure Monica Harris felt every second of his authority. "Nice ride," he muttered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. He tapped the hood twice with his knuckles. "Pretty unusual for someone like you." The words hung in the night air, heavy with venom. He didn't need to explain what he meant. Monica understood. Anyone listening would. He wasn't talking about her income or her job. He was talking about her skin. Monica's jaw tightened. She inhaled slowly, steadying herself the way she had taught her students when they faced unfairness in the classroom. Don't let them see you break. Still, the sting was there, settling across her face, betraying her composure. She could feel it in the way her cheeks warmed, in the way her heart sank. Cole leaned down toward the passenger window, shining his light across the dashboard, the leather seats, her work bag resting beside her. His lips curled into a smirk. "Go on, pop the trunk. Let's have a look." Monica blinked, surprised. "Excuse me, you heard me," he snapped. "Trunk, back seat, everything. Unless you've got something to hide." Her stomach turned, but she forced her voice to remain calm. "There's nothing to hide, officer. This is unnecessary." His laugh was sharp, mocking. "Lady Unnecessary is you in this car. Now open it up." With her fingers trembling, Monica reached for the trunk release. The latch clicked. Cole strode to the back, lifting the lid like a showman revealing a trick. He leaned inside, moved a few bags, and slammed it shut. "Back seat 2. Step out." By now, headlights from passing cars slowed. A couple of drivers pulled over, their curiosity piqued by the spectacle. Strangers stood on the sidewalk, their eyes darting between the flashing police lights and Monica, a lone black woman being interrogated like a criminal. The weight of their stares pressed on her chest. Each glance felt like a judgment, even from those who said nothing. She stepped out of the car, folding her arms tightly against the night air. She wasn't guilty, but humiliation didn't care about guilt. It burned all the same. Cole pushed the driver's seat forward, shining his flashlight into every shadowed corner. He crouched low, his movements quick, deliberate, yet to the bystanders, it looked routine. To Monica, though, there was something in the way his hand lingered too long under the seat. She turned briefly, reaching into her purse for another set of documents, proof of purchase, the insurance slip he had claimed might not be in order. It took only a few seconds. But in those seconds, everything changed. When she faced forward again, Cole was standing tall, his arm raised high. Between his gloved fingers was a small plastic bag filled with white powder that caught the glow of the headlights. "Well, well, well," he announced loudly, his voice carrying to every bystander who had gathered. "Drugs." "Exactly what I thought." Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A woman on the sidewalk clutched her child closer. A man shook his head. For them, the story was written in an instant. Cop finds drugs, black woman caught. Monica froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, but no words came. It was as though time had splintered, leaving her stranded between disbelief and despair. "That's a lie," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. "Those aren't mine. You planted that." Cole scoffed, holding the bag higher, turning so everyone could see. "Oh, sure, that's what they all say. Poor teacher, huh? Just driving home from class. Don't insult me." Inside, Monica's heart pounded, a mixture of rage and helplessness swirling until she thought she might collapse under it. She wanted to scream, to claw back her dignity, but her father's voice echoed again, "Don't give them a reason." And so she stood, shoulders trembling, eyes burning, hands clenching into fists she dared not raise. From the edge of the scene, another figure shifted. Sergeant Thomas Miller, a seasoned officer with more years in uniform than Cole had lived, stood watching, his brow furrowed slightly, his mouth a thin line. He didn't step forward, didn't say a word, but his eyes lingered on the bag, then on Monica's stricken face. Something in his silence wasn't not agreement. It was hesitation, a flicker of doubt, a seed quietly planted. The crowd whispered among themselves, half convinced of guilt, half unsettled by the cruelty in Cole's smirk. And there stood Monica, alone, framed by flashing lights, accused not by evidence, but by prejudice dressed up as proof. She had stepped out of her classroom only an hour earlier, proud of shaping young minds. Now, in the blink of an eye, she stood accused of a crime she hadn't even imagined. The injustice was naked, raw, undeniable. But the system, represented here by a badge and a flashlight, wasn't designed to see her innocence. Not tonight. And that was the moment the trap snapped shut. The patrol car idled at the curb, its red and blue lights flashing against the storefronts of a neighborhood Monica had walked through every evening for years. This was her street, her routine, her quiet slice of life after long days of teaching. Yet tonight she was cuffed in the back seat, her wrists raw against cold steel, her face turned toward a window fogged with her own breath. Outside, neighbors gathered like moths to a flame. Some whispered, others laughed outright, their words sharp as knives. "That's the teacher," one man muttered. "Always knew she thought she was better than us." A group of teenagers huddled close, holding their phones high, eager to capture shame dressed up as spectacle. A woman from the laundromat shaded her eyes beneath the pulsing light. "Is that Miss Harris?" she asked no one in particular, voice trembling between concern and gossip. A boy grinned as he typed a caption. "Local teacher busted, wait till you see this." Monica heard it all without lifting her head. She wanted to cry out that she had spent her evenings grading papers, her weekends buying supplies with her own money, her patience coaxing reluctant readers into confidence. But the louder the crowd became, the smaller her voice felt shrinking, until there was nothing left to push against the noise. Cole, the officer gripping her arm, relished the performance. His voice carried over the street, "Drugs found right in her purse. Guess you never really know people." His words weren't just for the report, they were for the bystanders, the phones, the narrative already spinning into something she couldn't control. Another officer, Sergeant Miller, met his eyes briefly. "Chain of custody." "You got it?" he asked under his breath. The words neutral, but the glance waited. "All clean," Cole shot back too quickly, already turning away. Miller didn't reply. His gaze lingered on Monica's empty cuffed hands, then dropped to the evidence bag, now sealed tight. He tucked away his unease, but the silence between them spoke louder than anything said aloud. The station swallowed Monica in a rhythm designed to erase her humanity. "Empty your pockets. Property in the tray. Sign here." She placed down a ring of key fob and a folded stack of essays still clipped with a red pen. "Face the wall, feet on the marks." The officer's tone never shifted. It was mechanical, like a script rehearsed 100 times. Then came the words that twisted like a cruel echo. "You have the right to remain silent." She almost laughed at the irony. Silence, she thought. That word again. But tonight, silence wasn't surrender. It was all she had left that no one could strip from her. When the flashbulb caught her face for the mugshot, it didn't ask her name the way a student might. It didn't care about the years behind her. It froze her in one merciless frame and moved on. Across town, parents' phones buzzed with messages. We trusted her. My son looked up to her. There's always a secret. In between, a single text appeared. She helped my boy learn to read. Don't be cruel. Monica would never see it, not tonight. Her voicemail filled faster than she could have listened. Some messages dripped with fear, some with anger, and one was only a sigh, as if someone had laid down a weight too heavy to carry. And yet somewhere amid the noise, a child's small voice slipped through a student, leaving a message in broken sentences. Miss Harris, I believe you. Those 4 words were fragile, trembling, but they burned steady in her mind like a candle no wind could snuff out. In the holding cell, Monica's resolve frayed. For a brief, dangerous moment, she considered surrendering, letting the tide of lies carry her away. She thought about using her one phone call, But who the neighbor feeding her cat, the secretary still sorting tomorrow's schedules? No one seemed right. She saw instead the face of a student pointing to the photo on her classroom wall, her younger standing tall on courthouse steps. She'd brushed it off then as just a memory. Maybe it had been a warning. Maybe it was a reminder. Not yet, she told herself. Call no one. Hold the line. The hours stretched measured by the distant thud of rubber stamps against forms. Down the hall, a clerk pressed one hard against the page. Arraignment 9:00 a.m. Key's rattled footsteps echoed, then faded until the building settled into its hollow after-hours quiet. Monica closed her eyes. In the hush, silence didn't shrink her, it steadied her. She breathed deep, letting the stillness spread like armor. She was a woman cuffed and cornered, yes. But she was also a teacher who had sown courage in others for years, a woman who knew the weight of dignity, even when it felt like ash in her hands. Morning would come, and with it, a courtroom. And in that room, truth would have its chance to speak through her or for her, but it would speak. Morning broke gray and heavy, the kind of sky that made the city feel slower, quieter, though the courthouse steps told another story. Reporters crowded shoulder-to-shoulder cameras, flashing microphones reaching like claws. They weren't waiting for a senator or a CEO. They were waiting for Monica Harris, a schoolteacher in a plain blouse and skirt, who now walked like every step might betray her. She held her chin low, eyes darting away from the lenses that wanted nothing more than to steal her face for headlines. Teacher and drug bust, local hero turned fraud. She could almost hear the captions forming before the shutters snapped shut. The chain of flashes followed her all the way to the courthouse doors, their clicking echoing like a cruel applause. Inside, the air shifted, cooler, quieter, but no less heavy. People leaned close to whisper, some out of pity, some out of disbelief. Monica's shoes tapped softly against the polished floor, but her presence, her bowed head, her silence rang louder than sound. At the front of the courtroom sat Judge Eleanor White. White hair swept neatly back, her black robe draped perfectly. She was a woman whose presence filled the room without effort. She had seen thousands of defendants over 3 decades, men and women who came through those doors with the same hollowed look Monica carried now. Her eyes, pale and sharp, settled on Monica not with warmth, but with that blend of suspicion and fatigue that comes from years of hearing the same pleas. Another one, she thought, though the words never left her lips. Another story that will unravel into excuses. Another promise broken by a trusted face. She held that thought in her chest, and it curved her posture into something cold, something unyielding. Then the heavy wooden doors creaked again, and Officer Cole strode in, as if the place belonged to him. His uniform pressed, his smile tucked neatly at the corner of his mouth. He moved with the confidence of a man who believed the system was stitched together for his protection. A quick glance around the room told him he had the upper hand. He had played this game before: plant the evidence, write the report, step back as the machine did the rest. Reporters scribbled his name down as though it carried weight, and a few nodded at him like he was the hero of the day. Cole's stride slowed just enough to enjoy the moment before he took his seat, when the bailiff called the court to order. The noise of the room folded into silence. The prosecutor, a man in a crisp suit who had barely skimmed the file that morning, rose and cleared his throat. He didn't need theatrics. He had what he thought was airtight evidence. The state charges Monica Harris with possession of illegal substances with intent to distribute. He declared, his voice loud and certain. The drugs were discovered in her personal belongings by Officer Cole during a lawful search. He paused just long enough for the words to sink in. The evidence bag has been submitted, Your Honor, with full chain of custody. To the crowd, it sounded simple, straightforward, almost routine. And in routine, guilt often feels like a foregone conclusion. At the defense table, Monica sat still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her head bowed, her lips pressed together as though holding back the entire weight of her defense. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't even lift her eyes. That silence unsettled some in the room. For others, it stirred fear. Why isn't she saying anything? A woman whispered from the gallery. Doesn't she know they'll crush her? Monica heard none of it. Or maybe she did and chose to hold it in. Either way, the impression she gave was one of surrender or maybe restraint. It was hard to tell. Judge White studied her with careful detachment. On the surface, her expression didn't break stern, neutral, professional. But something faint tugged beneath it. Monica didn't look like the others. There was no twitching knee, No frantic protests, no string of excuses spilling from her mouth. There was only silence, deliberate and calm. Still, Judge White steeled herself. Sympathy had no place here. Justice in her eyes demanded distance. And so she leaned back slightly in her chair, her gavel resting near her hand, her voice cold as she instructed the prosecutor to proceed. Cole sat taller when his name was mentioned. His jaw firmed, his chest swelled. He was ready to speak, ready to frame himself as the vigilant officer who had done his duty, protecting the community from a woman who had fooled them all. He glanced briefly toward Monica, his smirk barely hidden. But Monica never met his eyes. She remained still, her silence both fragile and unshakable. And that was when a ripple passed through the gallery, not of sound, but of tension. People leaned closer, sensing that something about this case didn't align. It was in the hush of the room, in the flicker of the judge's uncertain gaze, in the quiet courage of the woman who refused to beg. The trial had just begun, but already it felt different. Officer Cole leaned forward, his voice steady at first, as if rehearsed. He described the moment he discovered a small bag of narcotics inside Monica's car. According to his words, the drugs had been tucked neatly in the driver's seat pocket, visible the instant he leaned in. The account sounded polished, too polished, almost like it had been practiced word for word. But then something shifted. A question from the prosecutor prompted him to repeat the sequence. This time Cole's version stumbled. He claimed the drugs were found on the passenger side, hidden under a floor mat. The contradiction slipped out casually, almost unnoticed, but the damage was done. It was the first crack in what had seemed like a flawless wall of lies. Daniel saw it instantly. His pen scratched across his notepad, underlining the words with quick strokes. He didn't smile, didn't gloat, but his eyes sharpened. For the first time since the trial began, he leaned back slightly, the weight of despair lifting just enough for his shoulders to loosen. To anyone else, it might have looked like simple note-taking, but for Monica, it was a lifeline. She caught his glance. Her eyes, heavy from weeks of humiliation, carried an unspoken plea. Do you believe me? Do I still matter in this courtroom? The silence between them stretched fragile but alive. Daniel answered with the smallest of gestures, a subtle nod, firm and deliberate. It wasn't just reassurance. It was a promise. Monica's lips trembled, not in fear this time, but in quiet acknowledgement that she was not alone. The courtroom itself seemed to inhale. The jury shifted in their seats, brows furrowed. Whispers rippled through the gallery, a current of disbelief breaking against the walls. The contradiction was small. Yes, but in a place where truth was meant to stand unshaken, even the faintest tremor could shake confidence. Judge White, perched high on the bench, felt it too. His face betrayed nothing, his jaw locked, his posture stiff, but his eyes narrowed just slightly. It was the look of a man who had heard thousands of testimonies and knew when something didn't add up. Still, he chose restraint. He gave no rebuke, offered no correction, simply tapped his gavel once to quiet the murmurs and let the testimony continue. Yet the silence he enforced was heavy, like a pause that carried its own accusation. Cole, sensing the shift, cleared his throat and pressed on, pretending his words hadn't betrayed him. But his voice had lost the easy rhythm it carried minutes before. Each sentence landed harder, slower, as though the weight of his own story was starting to strain him. Daniel kept writing his notes, no longer just observations, but ammunition. In his mind, the single contradiction wasn't enough to break the case open, not yet. But cracks, once they appear, have a way of spreading. For Monica, that moment meant everything. The nod from Daniel, the shift in the room, the subtle tightening of White's expression, it stitched together a fragile thread of hope. She straightened in her seat, her shoulders no longer curled inward, but lifted, if only slightly. Her silence was no longer the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone waiting for justice to speak on her behalf. And those in the gallery, neighbors, strangers, curious onlookers, felt the air change as well. They exchanged glances, leaned toward one another, whispering questions that none dared speak aloud. If he lied about that, what else isn't true? The sound of those whispers carried farther than they should have. They reached the ears of the jury, lingered at the edge of Judge White's bench, and followed Cole as he fumbled through the rest of his testimony. Each word he spoke now sat under a shadow measured against the slip he couldn't take back. Daniel closed his notebook with a quiet snap. He didn't need to say anything. His expression alone told Monica what she needed to know. He would not let this inconsistency vanish. He would weave it into something larger, something undeniable. The courtroom returned to order, but order didn't mean peace. A seed of doubt had been planted not just in Daniel's mind, but in the minds of every person present. And once a seed is planted, it doesn't stay hidden for long. It grows quietly, relentlessly, until even stone walls can no longer contain it. That was how it felt in that moment. The story so carefully crafted against Monica had been fractured. It was only a hairline crack, invisible to those who weren't paying close attention. But those who were, Daniel, Monica, even Judge White knew the truth. Once a wall begins to crack, it rarely stops at just one line. Daniel rose slowly, the weight of the room shifting with him. His voice carried no theatrics, only a calm precision as he asked the court's permission to play a piece of security footage. The request itself seemed ordinary, yet everyone leaned forward as if some unspoken instinct warned that the truth was about to flicker into sight. The screen lit up. Grainy black and white images filled the courtroom. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Parked a car, the shadow of Officer Cole bending toward it. But then the frame caught something undeniable. Cole lingered at the driver's side door longer than necessary, his arm dipping inside for several seconds, before straightening up and holding a small plastic bag aloft, announcing it as evidence. The room reacted all at once. Gasps cut through the silence. Whispers rose like wind through tall grass. Every eye swung from the screen back to Cole, waiting for an explanation that could not come. "That's just routine." Cole blurted, his voice louder than he intended. The words echoed brittle, stripped of authority. His hands fidgeted against the wooden railing, and though his body remained upright, his eyes betrayed him, darting away, refusing to meet the jury, the judge, or Monica herself. Monica did not move. She sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her back straight, her chin lifted ever so slightly. Her eyes no longer carried fear. They carried clarity. The camera had done what her words never could. In the quiet strength of her stillness, there was a message: I was telling the truth all along. The crowd felt it. Murmurs spread quickly, low, urgent voices weaving disbelief with suspicion. Some shook their heads. Others leaned closer to their neighbors, whispering questions they dared not ask aloud. For weeks they had been told who to believe, but the screen told a different story, one no polished testimony could erase. Judge White leaned forward. Her eyes narrowed, studying each flicker of the footage, replaying the moment in her mind. Beneath her composed expression, something unsettled began to stir. She had vouched for this officer with her silence, allowed his authority to stand unchallenged. Yet here in front of her, the camera whispered a dangerous question. Have you put your trust in a liar? The weight of that doubt pressed heavy against her chest. For a moment, she looked not like the unshakable figure behind the bench, but like a woman realizing the ground beneath her feet might not be stone at all. It might be sand. Cole tried again, his words tumbling out too fast. The angle's bad. You can't really see what's happening. I was following protocol. But his voice wavered, thin and uncertain, every syllable peeling away his authority instead of restoring it. Then came the lifeline he was desperate for. The prosecutor rose, brushing the moment aside with a quick wave of his hand. The footage is blurry, he argued smoothly. We can't draw conclusions from a few indistinct frames. The jury must remember, security cameras distort and shadows mislead. The energy in the room shifted again. Doubt, which moments earlier had felt like fire spreading, now cooled under the weight of official language. The whispers died down, shoulders slumped. A sigh rippled through the gallery, frustration, fear, the familiar sting of watching justice bend beneath the will of those who wielded power. For Monica, it was a cruel reminder. One moment the truth had been clear as daylight. The next it was smudged, blurred, pushed back into the shadows by words dressed in authority. She tightened her hands together, forcing herself not to tremble. Hope was not gone, but it was fragile again. Daniel's jaw clenched. He knew this fight was far from over. The footage was imperfect, yes, but imperfection didn't erase what the world had just seen. He glanced at the jury, searching for the flicker in their eyes. Some looked shaken, others cautious. Doubt had been planted, though the prosecutor had tried to bury it. Seeds once sown rarely die so quickly. Judge White tapped her gavel, once restoring order. The echo was sharp, final, but inside her order did not exist. She stared at the frozen frame on the screen, the officer's arm deep inside the car, and felt a quiet war begin within herself. And the audience, those ordinary people who had come to witness justice, leaned back with uneasy silence. They asked themselves the question no one dared voice. Would the truth survive this courtroom, or would it once again be twisted until it could no longer be recognized? The answer would not come today. But the image remained burned into every mind present, because no matter what words followed, no matter how polished the arguments became, the footage had left a scar, and scars don't fade easily. The courtroom was holding its breath. The air, heavy from the lingering echo of the video evidence, seemed to press down on everyone's chest. Daniel leaned forward, voice calm but insistent, each question sharper than the last. "Officer Cole," he said, "you testified the package was on the passenger seat. Earlier you said the driver's seat. Now on the tape we see you reaching under the car before producing it. Which one is true?" Cole shifted, jaw tightening. "I told you it was procedure." Daniel didn't flinch. "Procedure doesn't change the laws of physics. You can't be in two places at once." A ripple of murmurs ran through the crowd. Cole's hand twitched, as if fighting the urge to reach for something, anything to defend himself. His voice grew louder, more defensive. "You're twisting this. You don't understand what it's like out there." Daniel let the silence stretch, giving the officer enough rope to pull his own noose tighter. Then it happened. Cole slammed his palm flat against the wooden table, the sound cracking through the room like a gunshot. His face turned red, veins throbbing on his neck. And then the words spilled out, raw and unfiltered. "People like her always lie their way out." It was more than an outburst. It was venom. The room froze. You could have heard a pin drop. Reporters stopped scribbling mid-sentence. Even the bailiff, who had stood stiff-backed all morning, blinked in disbelief. Judge White's eyes flew wide open. For a moment, the mask she'd worn, the mask of distance, of cold professionalism, slipped. She wasn't looking at evidence now. She wasn't weighing motions or objections. She was staring at naked prejudice standing right in front of her. The thump of her gavel didn't come immediately. Instead, there was a pause, as if she herself needed a breath to absorb what had just been said. Cole, realizing his mistake, tried to backpedal, his voice cracking. I didn't mean, but the damage was done." His words hung in the air like smoke that couldn't be waved away. And then Monica moved. She had sat so still all morning, eyes lowered, shoulders heavy with the weight of the accusations, enduring the cold stares and whispered judgments. But now slowly she lifted her head. Her eyes met Cole's, steady and unshaken. Her voice, clear and unwavering, cut through the silence. "No, officer," she said. "People like you have lied their way for too long." It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The quiet strength behind it carried farther than any shout could. A shiver seemed to run through the audience. Reporters dropped their pens, not to stop writing, but to really listen. Strangers exchanged glances, as if silently acknowledging they had just witnessed something more profound than courtroom theater. Daniel looked at Monica with a flicker of pride. He hadn't told her to speak. She didn't need anyone's permission. For the first time since her arrest, she wasn't merely defending herself. She was confronting the system head-on. Judge White leaned back, her fingers tightening around the edges of her bench. She exhaled slowly, her own thoughts clashing beneath her composed exterior. All morning she had seen Monica through a lens clouded by skepticism, assuming this case would be like countless others. But in Cole's eruption, she had heard more than anger. She had heard the truth about bias, about the rot that could hide behind a badge. For the audience, the shift was palpable. No longer was Monica the silent defendant, painted guilty by the weight of police testimony. She was the calm eye in the storm, while Cole stood exposed, his prejudice laid bare for all to see. Cole's lawyer reached for his arm, whispering furiously, trying to contain the flames. But it was useless. Everyone had seen the crack in the mask, and there was no way to pretend it hadn't happened. Daniel turned toward Judge White, his voice low but resonant. "Your Honor, I believe the officer has just told us more than any document or testimony ever could." The judge didn't answer immediately. She only stared at Cole, her expression torn between shock and disappointment. She knew everyone knew that justice wasn't just about evidence on paper. It was about the character of those who claimed to uphold it. For Monica, the moment was a turning point. She wasn't just enduring anymore. She was fighting not with fists, not with rage, but with truth. And the jury, though silent, though instructed not to react, could not unhear what had been said. It was as if the courtroom itself had shifted. The power dynamic that had weighed so heavily against Monica was beginning to tilt. Not completely, not yet, but the balance had cracked, and cracks have a way of widening. In the stunned stillness that followed, one thing became clear. The trial was no longer about whether Monica had slipped past the law. It was about whether the law itself could slip past the truth. And in that instant, for the first time, Monica didn't look like a woman fighting alone. She looked like the embodiment of something larger, a quiet defiance that gave voice to every soul who had been crushed under the same weight of prejudice. The courtroom was holding its breath again. You could almost feel the air growing heavy, like everyone was waiting for the final card to be laid on the table. And that card came from Daniel Moore. The young public defender rose slowly, his notes trembling slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to reveal. He cleared his throat, his voice calm, steady yet firm enough to cut through the tension. "Your Honor, the defense has obtained results from the forensic lab," Daniel announced, lifting a folder as if it carried the very heart of justice in CETA. The jury leaned forward. Even Judge White adjusted her glasses, her gaze narrowing. Daniel walked closer to the evidence table and placed the report down. The lab analyzed the package Officer Cole claims was found in Ms. Monica Reed's vehicle. And here is the conclusion: the only fingerprints found on that bag belonged to Officer Cole himself. No others. The silence after his words was deafening. Cole shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, his face suddenly pale beneath the courtroom lights. His lips moved as if searching for a defense, but nothing came out. Then, like fate pressing its hand into the scene, another figure stood. Sergeant Miller. The same man who had sat quietly in the gallery earlier, the one who had been torn between loyalty and truth. His hands shook slightly as he raised them, asking permission to speak. "Your Honor," Miller said, his voice unsteady, but his eyes filled with a kind of desperate courage. "I can no longer stay silent. I heard Officer Cole. I heard him brag. He said, and I quote, 'Sometimes you have to remove the ones you can't trust by any means necessary.' He spoke about planting evidence, about making sure people he thought didn't belong in his world were taken out of it." The words cut deeper than any knife. A shiver swept through the courtroom. Some gasped aloud. Others shook their heads, eyes wide in disbelief. But most knew deep down this was the truth they had suspected all along. Judge White leaned back, her lips pressed tight. For a long moment she didn't move, just stared at Cole as if the very robe she wore demanded she face the ugliness standing before her. Then she slammed the gavel down, the sound cracking through the chamber like thunder. "Bailiff," she commanded, her voice cold and sharp, "place Officer Cole under arrest. Effective immediately." The room erupted. Applause thundered mixed with tears, sighs, even a few shouts of anger at the man being dragged away in cuffs. Some people stood to their feet, clapping until their hands turned red. Others simply wept quietly, shoulders shaking with the release of fear and anger they had carried for too long. And Monica sat still at first, as if her body had not yet caught up with her spirit. Slowly she lowered her head. Tears slid down her cheeks, not in triumph, not in pride, but in the fragile relief of someone who had been held underwater for too long and could finally breathe again. Her hands trembled as she wiped at her face. The corners of her lips quivered into the faintest, most exhausted smile. A smile not for herself, but for the truth. Judge White turned her eyes toward her then. For the first time since the trial began, the stern, distant mask cracked. A flush of shame crossed her face. She had doubted Monica, doubted her humanity, her innocence, her voice. And now she felt the weight of that misjudgment. For a heartbeat, it seemed the whole courtroom was frozen on the sight. The proud black woman, tears falling, but dignity unbroken, and the judge who finally understood how wrong she had been. In that moment, justice didn't just come from the gavel. It came from the courage of a young lawyer, the conscience of a hesitant sergeant, and the quiet resilience of a woman who refused to let hatred write her story. The final truth had broken free, and once it did, there was no way to cage it again. The trial might have ended, but the story was far from over. As the bailiffs escorted Cole out of the courtroom, the walls practically shook with the noise of reporters scrambling to their feet. Cameras flashed, microphones waved in the air, voices shouted over one another. To them, Monica Reed was a miracle story, a simple teacher who had somehow survived a nightmare of false accusations and walked out vindicated. "Miss Reed, how does it feel to have justice on your side?" one journalist shouted. "Did you ever think this day would come at another pushed in?" At first, Monica stayed quiet. Her eyes were still damp, her hands folded gently in front of her as if she were centering herself in the chaos. She gave a small nod, not the triumphant grin they wanted, but a quiet acknowledgement. To the crowd, she looked like a modest school teacher who had simply gotten lucky. But the truth was so much bigger. From the back of the courtroom, a voice rose hesitant but loud enough to cut through the clamor. It came from an older man in the community, someone who had been watching the trial from day one. "She's not just a teacher," he called out. His words pulled every eye toward him. "You folks don't realize who she really is." Monica Reed once worked for the Department of Justice. She wrote policies, real ones, that push back against racial discrimination. Some of those recommendations shaped the very laws we live under today. The room froze. Cameras whipped around reporters, scribbled furiously, and whispers spread like wildfire. A few gasps slipped from the jury box itself. Judge White shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly blindsided. It was as though the curtain had finally been pulled back. Suddenly, those little hints, the photograph of her with smiling students, the curious way her pupils asked if she had ever changed laws, the grace with which she carried herself even when insulted. All of it made sense. This wasn't just coincidence. The woman who had been framed and humiliated that was no stranger to the fight for justice. She had lived it, breathed it, and shaped it long before she ever walked back into that courtroom. Monica lowered her gaze, almost embarrassed by the revelation. She hadn't wanted the spotlight to shine on who she used to be. Her path had been deliberate. Years ago, she had stepped away from the prestige and power of her position in Washington. She had traded the marble halls of government buildings for the small classrooms of her community. Why? Because she believed true change didn't begin with lawmakers behind closed doors. It began with children with education, with showing the next generation that dignity, fairness, and courage mattered in everyday life. She chose the chalkboard over the courtroom, not because she couldn't handle the fight, but because she understood where the battle really started. And now, standing here vindicated, but worn from the storm, her silence throughout the trial suddenly took on a whole new meaning. People thought she had been quiet because she was intimidated. They thought she had held her tongue because she was weak or afraid. But the truth was, Monica had chosen silence as her sharpest weapon. She let the system expose itself, let Cole's arrogance become his downfall. By refusing to argue, by resisting the bait, she gave him the space to dig his own grave. And when the truth finally broke free, it struck with the weight of thunder. The reporters didn't know how to frame it. The jury looked as though they'd just discovered they had been sitting across from history in the making. Even Judge White, still sitting in her high chair, seemed humbled to the core. And then from somewhere in the crowd, maybe it was a juror, maybe it was one of the townsfolk who had packed the gallery, came a whisper that grew into a murmur. He picked the wrong woman. The words rolled through the chamber like a tide, soft at first, then sharper, louder, more certain. Heads nodded, murmurs turned to hushed agreement, and by the time Monica stepped forward, those 5 words carried the weight of a verdict all their own. Because in the end, Cole hadn't just framed a teacher. He had tried to break a woman who had written the very language of justice he thought he could twist. He had underestimated her strength, her silence, her history. And in doing so, he had sealed his fate. The final chills swept through the crowd, goosebumps rising as the truth settled into their bones. This wasn't just relief. This was reckoning. And Monica Reed, calm, composed, still standing tall, was living proof that sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the loudest power. For a long moment, the courtroom was still. The chaos of flashing cameras, the murmurs, the shifting feet, all of it seemed to pause as Monica stepped forward. She didn't raise her hands in triumph. She didn't smile for the cameras. Instead, she drew in a steady breath, her voice calm, yet strong enough to cut through the noise. "This was never about me," she said, her words echoing like a quiet hymn. "It was about the truth." You could feel the shift in the room. At first there was a roar, cheers, clapping, a rush of sound like a wave crashing against the shore. But just as quickly, it softened. Applause tapered into silence, replaced by something heavier, something more profound. People weren't just celebrating. They were thinking, reflecting. Her words had settled into them like seeds dropped into soil. Judge White sat still on her bench, hands folded before her eyes locked on Monica. All throughout the trial, she had seemed skeptical, stern, even dismissive at times. But now her expression had changed. Respect flickered across her face, unmistakable and genuine. She was no longer looking at Monica Reed as a defendant or even as a teacher. She was looking at a woman who had endured injustice with dignity and dismantled it with grace. And then came the sight that no one would forget. Cole. Just hours ago, his posture had screamed arrogance. His smirk had taunted the entire room, as if he believed no law, no jury, no voice could ever touch him. But now, shackled in handcuffs, his head hung low. The swagger had drained from his face, leaving only the hollow shell of a man who had dug his own grave and fallen into it. His eyes darted once toward Monica, but she didn't flinch. She didn't gloat. She didn't even look angry. She just stood there unshaken while the same system he thought he controlled dragged him away. The sound of the cuffs locking shut echoed like a bell ringing across the chamber, a bell of justice. The crowd parted as officers let him out. Some whispered, some stared, but all of them knew they had witnessed something irreversible. The balance had shifted. A wrong had been righted. In the days that followed, headlines screamed Monica's name, but she didn't linger in the spotlight. She didn't tour television studios or bask in the applause. Instead, she slipped quietly back to where she had always belonged, her classroom. And it was there among the chalk dust and wooden desks that the truest healing moment unfolded. The children saw her before she even stepped fully inside. Their eyes lit up, their faces broke into grins, and before she could say a word, they rushed toward her. Tiny arms wrapped around her waist, her shoulders, her hands. Laughter bubbled in the room, pure and unfiltered, the kind of sound that washed away weeks of pain. "Miss Reed, you're back!" one child cried. "We knew you didn't do anything wrong." Another shouted, holding onto her skirt, as if afraid she'd leave again. Monica knelt down so she could meet their eyes, her arms stretching to hold as many of them as she could. The weight of their embrace was different from the courtroom's applause. It wasn't about victory or vindication. It was about belonging, about love. In that small room with sunlight pouring across the chalkboard and children's voices filling the air, the story found its true ending. Not in the fall of a corrupt officer, not in the gasp of reporters, but in the return of a teacher to the children who needed her most. And that's when the message of it all became clear. Justice doesn't always arrive on time. Sometimes it limps, sometimes it stumbles, sometimes it hides in silence until the moment is right. But it never disappears. No matter how long it takes, no matter how many walls stand in its way, justice has a way of finding its voice. And prejudice, no matter how sharp or cruel, will never be stronger than the truth. Bias may bruise power, may intimidate, but truth endures. That day, as Monica Reed stood in the middle of her classroom, smiling through tears as her students clung to her, it was as if the world itself had whispered back to her words in the courtroom. It was never about her. It was always about the truth, and the truth had won, and that's where we'll leave it tonight. Monica's journey reminds us that while prejudice can be harsh and justice may take its time, the truth has a way of ringing louder than any lie. It's a story of courage, dignity, and hope. A reminder that change is possible when we refuse to give up. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to Mr. Max Stories for more powerful stories like this one. Every bit of support you give means the world to us. It fuels our team to keep creating meaningful, high-quality content that speaks to the heart. At Mr. Max Stories, we believe stories aren't just entertainment. They're echoes of justice, compassion, and truth. That's the spirit we carry in every tale we tell. So join us and let's keep the bell of justice ringing together.